She was a healer sworn to protect life, yet cast out as a criminal, her career and reputation shattered in the sterile, unforgiving glare of a corporate boardroom. He was a warrior forged in the crucible of war, a Navy SEAL searching for a sanctuary in the vast, silent wilderness, a peace his own mind refused to grant him. Their worlds were never meant to collide, separated by a chasm of experience and intent, but a desperate act of compassion and a hidden corporate conspiracy would turn a remote mountain town into a kill box. Dr. Aris Thorne believed she was saving a life. Silas merely wanted to be left alone with the ghosts of the men he couldn't save. Now, they are bound by a secret that poisons everything it touches, a secret a very powerful man is willing to kill for. How can one man and his dog, a lone guardian and his shadow, stand against a legacy of greed that has limitless resources and zero morality? Tell us where you are watching from in the comments below, and let us know if you believe in the unbreakable bond between a warrior and his K9. Silas ran a hand over the thick fur of his partner, Ghost. The Belgian Malinois didn't look up, his gaze fixed on the tree line, a living statue of lethal potential. The air here, high in the Cascades, was thin and sharp, smelling of pine and cold stone, a world away from the dust of Kandahar and the salt spray of the Pacific. This was meant to be his decompression, his long overdue return to quiet. But quiet was a luxury the world rarely afforded its protectors. A flicker of movement below, down on the winding mountain road, drew his eye. A vehicle, a generic black SUV, pulled to a screeching halt. A woman was thrown out, literally pushed from the passenger door to stumble and fall onto the gravel shoulder. A briefcase was tossed out after her. The door slammed shut and the SUV sped away, its tires spitting rocks. Silas remained perfectly still. This was not his concern. He was off the grid, a ghost by choice. But then the woman, Dr. Aris Thorne, though he didn't know her name yet, pushed herself to her knees. She ignored her own scraped hands and instead scrambled for the briefcase, clutching it to her chest like a shield. Her shoulders shook, not with fear, but with a kind of concentrated, desperate rage. Ghost let out a low, almost inaudible whine, a vibration Silas felt more than heard. The dog's focus was absolute. He saw what Silas saw, not a victim, but a fighter without a weapon, an animal cornered. And Silas, for all his desire for peace, had spent his entire adult life running toward the sound of the guns, defending the cornered. He was a guardian, and the instinct was a current that ran deeper than conscious thought. He rose, his movements economical and precise, a predator unfolding from stillness. The fog of leave began to dissipate, replaced by the ice-cold focus of the operator. The mountain was his sanctuary, and a threat had just been dumped on its doorstep. Silas and Ghost descended the ridge with a silence that was unnatural, moving through the dense undergrowth like smoke. He kept to the shadows, his approach a practiced art of non-existence. He watched her for a full 5 minutes before making his presence known. She had retrieved a small, whimpering bundle from the briefcase, a golden retriever puppy, its breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. She was murmuring to it, her voice a low, steady current of reassurance that was at odds with the violent way she had arrived. She was a doctor, he realized, seeing the way her hands moved over the tiny animal, a diagnostic grace in her touch. He stepped from the tree line, Ghost at his heel, a silent grey shadow. Aris flinched, spinning around, her body instantly coiled to fight or flee. She saw him, a tall figure clad in worn Carhartts and a faded flannel shirt. Yet he moved with a terrifying fluid grace that no logger possessed. And the dog beside him was not a pet. It was a weapon, its intelligent eyes tracking her every micro-movement. "You need help," Silas stated. It wasn't a question. His voice was gravelly, unused. Aris clutched the puppy tighter. "I need to be left alone." Her own voice was defiant, though laced with a tremor she couldn't hide. "They'll be back for me." "Who's they?" he asked, his eyes scanning the road, the opposite ridge, taking in the tactical landscape. Ghost mirrored him, ears swiveling, nose testing the wind. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the sick animal in her arms. "The kind of people you don't want to meet." He took another step closer, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "The kind of people I specialize in meeting." The statement hung in the cold air, absolute and unquestionable. She saw it then, in the hard lines of his face, in the calm, assessing predator's gaze. This was a man who understood violence. She was a veterinarian, a healer. Until today, her greatest battles were fought against parvovirus and cancer. Now, she was on the run from men in black SUVs because she refused to let a puppy die. She explained it in a torrent of words, the story tumbling out, the high-tech veterinary research facility funded by biotech giant Omnigen, the string of unexplained puppy deaths, the proprietary vitamin supplement they were all forced to administer. She had suspected the supplement was the cause, a poison masquerading as a cure. So she had swapped it out for a simple saline solution and stolen a dose of broad-spectrum antibiotics, a desperate attempt to save this one last patient. She was caught, accused of corporate espionage and theft, and thrown out with a final chilling warning from the head of security. Forget what she saw. "They're not just puppies," she finished, her voice raw. "They're test subjects, and the test is failing." Silas listened without interruption. His internal calculus was simple. A powerful corporation, a cover-up, a woman who chose to protect the innocent over protecting herself. It was a language he understood perfectly. Ghost nudged his hand, then padded softly over to Aris, sitting calmly at her feet and looking up at the sick puppy. It was the dog's final vote of confidence. "My cabin is a mile up the ridge," Silas said, his decision made. "It's secure. You and the patient can stay there." He was offering her sanctuary, but they both knew he was also declaring himself a combatant in a war he knew nothing about. The cabin was not a home. It was a fortress disguised as one. Built of thick, hand-hewn logs, it was nestled into a granite cliff face, offering a commanding view of the valley below, with only one defensible approach. Inside, it was Spartan and meticulously organized. A wood stove, a small kitchen, a cot, and a rack of gear that spoke volumes about its owner. There were no photographs, no personal mementos, only the tools of survival. For Aris, who had spent the last 2 years of her military career as a ranger medic before trading her uniform for a lab coat, the place felt unnervingly familiar. It was a forward operating base for a one-man army. She set up a space for the puppy near the warmth of the stove, administering the antibiotics she'd managed to save. The small creature, whom she had started calling Lucky, was barely responsive. Silas watched her work, his presence a silent, looming weight in the small space. He saw the same methodical focus in her that he saw in the best combat medics, an ability to shut out the chaos and focus entirely on the life in her hands. "You've done this before," he observed, gesturing vaguely at her efficient setup. Different species, she replied without looking up, her attention fixed on monitoring the puppy's breathing. Same stakes. A flicker of understanding passed between them. They were veterans of different wars, carrying different scars, but they recognized the echoes of service in each other. He saw the tension in her shoulders that never quite went away, the way her eyes constantly scanned the windows. She saw the rigid control in his posture, the way he seemed to occupy a space without ever truly being at rest. Ghost lay between them, a furry bridge across the divide of their shared trauma. Later, as dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, Iris took a blood sample from Lucky. Using a portable analysis kit from her briefcase, the one piece of her old life she'd managed to grab, she began to work. Silas cleaned his rifle on the simple wooden table, the metallic scrape and click of the bolt the only sound in the room. The smell of gun oil and antiseptic filled the small cabin. He was a protector, and his tools were meant to preserve life by ending threats. She was a protector, and her tools were meant to mend and heal. Here, in this isolated sanctuary, their purposes had become one and the same. "Found something," she said suddenly, her voice tight. She turned the screen of the data pad toward him. A string of complex molecular markers scrolled past. "These aren't normal canine genetics. There are synthetic protein sequences here. Markers I've only ever seen in experimental gene therapy proposals. They're not just giving these puppies a supplement, Silas. They're rewriting their DNA." The revelation landed with a heavy thud. This was bigger than a faulty medicine. Omnigen wasn't just covering up a mistake. They were hiding the nature of their entire project. And Iris hadn't just stolen antibiotics. She had stolen the living proof of their unsanctioned, dangerous research. At that moment, a soft chime emanated from a small, rugged laptop in the corner, a device Silas had linked to a series of motion-activated trail cams. A red circle appeared on a topographic map of the area, blinking insistently. It was a mile down the trail. "Contact," Silas said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He was already moving, strapping on a chest rig, grabbing a suppressed rifle. The sanctuary had been breached. The hunt had begun. The two men moved through the woods with the clumsy arrogance of city dwellers who believed their expensive gear made them invisible. They wore matching tactical vests and carried short-barreled rifles, but they snapped twigs, dislodged stones, and spoke in low, grumbling voices that carried in the still mountain air. Amateurs. Silas watched them from 100 yards away, lying prone in a thicket of ferns, completely concealed. Ghost was beside him, utterly motionless, a coiled spring of controlled aggression. Silas didn't need the dog to tell him these men were a threat, but the low, almost subsonic growl rumbling in Ghost's chest confirmed their hostile intent. They weren't hikers. They weren't hunters. They were searching. He recognized their pattern, a basic pincer movement designed to flush something out, or someone. He had left Iris back at the cabin, the heavy wooden door bolted, a shotgun propped nearby. She had protested, her ranger training screaming at her to be part of the defense, but he had been firm. "You're the mission objective," he told her. "Protect the asset." He had used the cold, impersonal language of his old life because it was the only way to make her understand the stakes. The asset was her, the puppy, and the data she carried. They were the legacy of truth that had to survive. The two men below converged on the game trail that led toward the cabin. One of them paused, pulling out a thermal scope, scanning the trees. Silas felt a flicker of professional respect. They were clumsy, but not entirely incompetent. He let the man scan past his position. His body temperature was masked by the damp earth and the thick, gilly blanket he wore. He was just another cold spot in the forest. He waited. Patience was a weapon, and his was honed to a razor's edge. The men moved on, past his position, continuing up the trail. This was the moment. He gave a single, sharp click of his tongue. Ghost exploded from his side, a grey blur streaking through the underbrush on a flanking vector they had practiced 1,000 times. The dog made no sound, a silent missile of fur and teeth. Silas moved simultaneously, rising and following in the wake of the enemy team, his footfalls making less noise than the whisper of the wind. The plan was simple: isolate, neutralize. He closed the distance until he was only 20 feet behind the rear man. The man's focus was forward, his senses dulled by the false security of the wilderness. Silas raised his rifle. A soft, wet phut echoed twice. The rear man crumpled without a sound. His partner, alerted by the sudden weight of his falling comrade, began to turn. But before he could fully process what was happening, Ghost was on him. The dog didn't go for the throat. He was trained for control. He hit the man's gun arm with the force of a freight train, jaws locking onto the forearm, driving him backward off his feet. The man screamed, a raw, terrified sound that was abruptly cut off as Silas's boot came down on his throat. It was over in less than 10 seconds. No return fire, no alarm raised. Just 2 neutralized threats lying in the moss. Silas knelt, Ghost already at his side, releasing the arm on a quiet command. The dog looked up at him, awaiting the next order. Silas quickly searched the bodies, finding encrypted radios, sidearms, and a datapad. He tucked the datapad into his vest. This was more than a simple search party. This was an extermination squad sent to erase a problem. And he had just announced that the problem was fighting back. Back in the cabin's tense silence, the captured datapad was a Pandora's box. While Silas stood watch, his senses stretched out into the surrounding forest like an invisible net. Aris worked to break the device's encryption. Her fingers flew across the screen, her background in data-heavy research giving her an unexpected edge. She wasn't a hacker, but she understood logic gates and security protocols. After an hour of frustrated effort, a password hint finally appeared. Project Chimera. Aris's blood ran cold. Chimera wasn't just a myth. It was a theoretical concept in bleeding-edge genetics, the creation of an organism incorporating genetic material from different species. What Omnigen was doing wasn't just gene therapy. It was something far more radical and forbidden. "I'm in," she whispered. The screen populated with files, lab notes, and video logs. What they saw was horrifying. Omnigen, under the direction of its amoral CEO, Julian Croft, wasn't trying to create a better breed of dog. They were using the puppies as organic incubators, growing specialized tissues and custom-tailored antibodies for the ultra-wealthy. The vitamin supplement was the viral vector that initiated the genetic changes, turning the animals into living biofactories. But the process was dangerously unstable. The video logs showed the grim reality. Puppies developing catastrophic immune reactions, organ failures, and neurological breakdowns. The project was a failure, but Croft was too invested to pull the plug. He had pre-sold the treatments to his powerful clients, promising miracle cures. He was covering his losses, burying the failures one dead puppy at a time. and preparing to go to market with a product he knew was lethal. "He's not selling a cure," Iris said, her face pale in the glow of the screen. "He's selling a time bomb. These antibodies, if introduced into a human host, the cascading failure would be exponentially worse." The stolen antibiotics she had administered to Lucky had inadvertently fought off the secondary infections caused by the viral vector's assault on his system, giving his body a fighting chance to stabilize. She hadn't just saved a puppy, she had preserved the one living specimen that proved the chimera process could, with intervention, be survived, making him the single most dangerous piece of evidence against Omnigen. Silas absorbed the information with a grim stillness. His world was black and white, threats and non-threats, hostiles and friendlies. Julian Croft and Omnigen had just been moved definitively into the threats column. This was no longer just about protecting Iris. It was about dismantling an operation that valued profit over life, a philosophy he had fought against his entire career. He looked over at Lucky, who was now sleeping peacefully, his breathing deeper and more regular. The small animal was a symbol of defiance. He was the legacy they had to protect. "They'll send more," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "Better equipped. More men." He picked up the Dead Scouts radio, listening to the encrypted chatter. It was coded, but the increase in traffic, the clipped, urgent tones, told him everything he needed to know. The hornet's nest had been kicked, and the swarm was coming. The sanctuary was about to become a kill box, and he was the sole guardian at the gate. Julian Croft stood in his office, a glass-walled cage suspended 50 stories above the Seattle mist. The city below was a blur of lights, a kingdom he had built on risk and ruthless ambition. The room was a monument to his success, minimalist art, Italian furniture, a single perfect orchid on his marble desk. He radiated an aura of untouchable power, a man for whom the rules were merely suggestions. He listened to the report from his head of security, a man known only as the Warden, a former private military contractor with a reputation for brutal efficiency. Croft's face, usually a mask of calm, predatory confidence, was tight with fury. 2 men, neutralized? Croft's voice was dangerously quiet. By a veterinarian. You assured me this would be a simple retrieval, Warden. The Warden's voice crackled over the speakerphone, strained and defensive. The situation has evolved, sir. The asset has acquired assistance, ex-military by the look of it. Professional. Croft's fist clenched. A loose end. He hated loose ends. The entire Chimera project was his legacy, the culmination of a decade of morally ambiguous research. It was his ticket to not just wealth, but a place in history. The potential applications were limitless, a medical revolution for those who could afford it. The dead puppies were a rounding error, a necessary cost of progress. But this woman, this self-righteous, bleeding heart vet, threatened to unravel it all. And now she had a protector. I don't care if she's being protected by an entire SEAL team, Croft hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. I want the data. I want the specimen, and I want her erased. I am authorizing you to use the full team. No witnesses, no survivors. Level the entire mountain if you have to. Is that clear? Crystal, sir, the Warden replied, a hint of grim satisfaction in his tone. The call ended. Croft turned to look out at the city again, the rage receding, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. He had built his empire by excising weaknesses, by cutting out anything that threatened the bottom line. This woman and her mysterious guardian were a tumor, a malignancy that required immediate and overwhelming surgical removal. Down on the mountain, the first flakes of a sudden snow squall began to fall, the temperature dropping with the fading light. Silas watched the weather front roll in, a curtain of grey and white that swallowed the peaks. It would provide cover, but it would also make the terrain treacherous. He felt the shift in the air, a palpable increase in pressure that had nothing to do with the weather. He could feel them coming. The Warden's team would be different. They wouldn't be clumsy scouts. They would be hunters, moving with purpose and skill. The game had changed. He checked his gear, his mind a quiet, focused machine, processing threat vectors, fields of fire, and escape routes. He and Aris worked in tandem, she reinforcing the cabin's windows and doors, while he prepared kill zones and fallback positions outside. Ghost paced restlessly, a living barometer of the rising tension. The mountain, his intended sanctuary, was now a chessboard, and a bloody game was about to be played. The first wave had been a probe. The next would be an assault, designed to crush them with sheer, overwhelming force. The assault began not with a bang, but with a whisper. Under the cover of the swirling snow, the Warden's team moved into position. They were a dozen strong, clad in winter camouflage, moving with a disciplined silence that marked them as true professionals. They established a perimeter, cutting off all escape routes. Silas watched them through the thermal scope of his rifle, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He was hidden in a sniper's nest he'd prepared in a rocky outcrop overlooking the cabin. He had left Aris and Ghost inside, with strict instructions. They were the bait in his trap. The plan was simple, brutal, and relied on the enemy's arrogance. They would assume he was holed up with her, ready for a siege. They would focus on the cabin, the obvious target, allowing him to become the ghost he was named for. He let them get comfortable, let them believe they had the element of surprise. He watched the Warden directing his men with hand signals, a large, imposing figure who moved with the confidence of a man who had never known defeat. They were setting up for a dynamic entry, a full frontal assault. It was textbook, it was predictable, and it was exactly what Silas wanted. He waited until two men were prepping a breaching charge on the cabin door. He centered the crosshairs on the first man and squeezed the trigger. The suppressed shot was a cough in the wind, lost in the howl of the snowstorm. The man dropped. His partner spun, confused, searching for the source of the attack. A second cough. The second man fell. Panic, brief but potent, rippled through the attacking force. They had walked into a kill box. The Warden roared orders, his voice cutting through the storm. "Contact rear. Find him." They returned fire, but they were shooting blind, spraying bullets into the shadows, their muzzle flashes giving Silas a perfect map of their positions. He didn't return fire. He was escaping. He was a weapon without a target. He melted back from the sniper's nest, Ghost appearing at his side, as if summoned from the snow itself. Together, they began a wide, circling maneuver, using the storm as their cloak. The mountain was his ally. He knew every trail, every crevice, every deadfall. He led them on a deadly chase through the woods, striking and fading, a phantom menace that was always on their flank. He used a series of pre-placed traps, not to kill, but to wound and disorient. A snare that hoisted a man screaming into the trees. A tripwire that triggered a deafening flashbang, temporarily blinding another squad. Inside the cabin, Aris listened to the controlled chaos, her heart pounding. She had a role to play, Using the captured radio, she broadcasted on their frequency, reading lines from the Chimera project files, her voice calm and clear. Subject 7, K9, Golden Retriever, catastrophic liver failure. Subject 9, Beagle Mix, acute neurological decay. She was waging psychological warfare, letting them know exactly what they were dying for: a failed experiment and the ego of a corrupt CEO. The hunters were becoming the hunted, lost in a blizzard on a mountain that belonged to a man far more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. The warden was no fool. He recognized the strategy of a superior operator bleeding his forces, turning their strength into a liability. He was losing men, and his quarry was still a ghost in the storm. Furious, he consolidated his remaining 6 men and made a tactical decision. He would ignore the phantom in the woods and commit everything to the primary objective: the cabin. If he could secure the asset and the specimen, he could force the operator's hand. He gambled that the protector wouldn't abandon what he was protecting. It was a sound tactical choice. It was also a fatal mistake. Silas had anticipated this move. As the warden and his team made their final, desperate push for the cabin, Silas and Ghost were already waiting, hidden inside a shallow cave he had previously stalked, directly in their path. The fight became intimate and brutal. It was no longer a sniper's game, but a close-quarters battle fought with knives, hands, and teeth in the blinding snow. Ghost was a force of nature, a 70-pound blur of controlled fury. He moved in perfect concert with Silas, disabling, disrupting, creating openings. He would drag one man down by the leg while Silas engaged another, a seamless dance of violence. The mercenaries were highly trained, but they were trained to fight men. They had no answer for the primal, terrifying efficiency of a combat-hardened SEAL and his K9 partner working as a single entity. The fight devolved into a series of frantic, desperate duels. Silas moved through them like a wraith, his movements a symphony of lethal economy. A silenced pistol, the blade of his knife, the butt of his rifle, every action had a purpose. He was not fighting with rage, but with a cold, concentrated purpose that was far more terrifying. Finally, it was just him and the warden. The big man was a bull, powerful and relentless, swinging his rifle like a club. He charged Silas, driving him back against a snow-laden pine. For a moment, the warden's superior size and strength seemed to give him the upper hand. He pinned Silas, his hands closing around Silas's throat. "You're good," the warden rasped, his face inches from Silas's. "But you're just one man." Silas didn't respond. He didn't need to. A grey streak shot out of the swirling snow. Ghost latched onto the warden's thigh, his jaws grinding down with incredible force. The warden roared in pain and surprise, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all the opening Silas needed. He drove his knee up into the warden's chest and brought the hilt of his knife down on the man's temple. The big man staggered back, his eyes wide with disbelief, before collapsing into the snow. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the wind and the heavy panting of man and dog. Silas stood over the last of his enemies, his body bruised and aching, but his purpose clear. He looked toward the cabin, a single point of light in the storm. The sanctuary was violated, but it had held. The Guardians had won. In the aftermath of the battle, the mountain was eerily quiet. The snow continued to fall, a soft white blanket covering the evidence of the brutal fight. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the wood stove felt like a different world. The air was thick with the smell of blood, antiseptic, and wet dog. Aris worked silently, stitching a deep gash on Silas's arm. Her hands were steady, her field medic training taking over. She had seen worse, but the grim reality of what had just happened, the sheer violence of it, hung heavy between them. Silas sat stoically, his gaze distant. He was processing the fight, the triage, as he called it, analyzing every move, every decision. He had protected the sanctuary, but the cost was its violation. This place of peace had been tainted by the very world he had tried to escape. Ghost lay at his feet, his head on his paws, but his eyes were alert, watching Aris's every move with a quiet intensity. He had a shallow wound on his shoulder, which Aris had already cleaned and dressed. The dog had saved his life, a debt Silas could never truly repay, but would honor with a fierce, unspoken loyalty. "They're all gone," Silas stated, his voice a low rasp. It was a simple fact, but it carried the weight of the dozen lives he had just ended. He felt no triumph, only the grim satisfaction of a necessary job completed. Aris finished the last stitch and taped a bandage over the wound. "It wasn't your fault, Silas. You didn't start this." "But I finished it," he replied, and the finality in his tone closed the subject. He walked over to the warden's gear, which he had dragged inside. He pulled out the man's satellite phone. Unlike the encrypted radios of the grunts, this one had a direct, unencrypted channel to the man who gave the orders. He pressed the call log. There was only one number. A cold smile touched Silas's lips for the first time. He activated the phone's recording function and hit redial. The call connected almost instantly. "Is it done?" Julian Croft's voice was sharp, impatient, accustomed to immediate obedience. "Is the loose end tied off?" Silas let the silence stretch, letting Croft's anxiety build in his glass tower 50 stories above the world. Then he spoke, his voice as cold and unforgiving as the mountain winter. "Your man gave his life in service to your legacy, Mr. Croft." The silence on the other end was electric. Silas could almost hear the gears turning in Croft's mind, the dawning horror. "Who is this?" Croft demanded, his voice losing its arrogant edge, replaced by a tremor of fear. "I am the guardian of the loose end you created," Silas said calmly. "And we have your confession. We have the data. We have the living specimen. Your legacy of greed is over. We are coming for you." He ended the call, the recording saved. They had it all, the final piece of evidence. He looked at Aris, then at the sleeping puppy. Lucky, a testament to their fight. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were avengers. The mission had changed from defense to offense. The hike out of the mountains was a different journey. They were no longer running. They were advancing. The storm had passed, leaving the world clean and white under a brilliant, cold sun. The ruined sanctuary was behind them, a memory of a peace that was never truly there. Silas carried a small hard case containing the datapad and the warden's sat phone. Aris carried Lucky, now awake and alert, nestled inside her jacket. The puppy was their living proof, a symbol of hope and a weapon of truth. They moved with a shared purpose, the unspoken bond between them forged in the crucible of the last 24 hours. He was the shield, and she was the spear. Together, they were a force Julian Croft had never anticipated. They reached the small town at the base of the mountain by midday. It was a sleepy place of logging trucks and diners, a world away from the corporate warfare they were waging. Silas had made a call on the sat phone before they left the cabin to a number he hadn't used in years, a ghost from his past, a man who owed him a debt. A quiet rendezvous was arranged. They met their contact in the back booth of a nearly empty diner. He was a man in a rumpled suit who looked more like a history professor than the top investigative journalist he was. His name was Ben, and his eyes lit up with a familiar fire when Aris laid out the evidence, the lab notes, the video logs, the puppy, and finally, the recording of Julian Croft himself. Ben listened, his expression growing grimmer with every detail. He understood the stakes, the power of a corporation like Omnigen to bury stories and ruin lives. But he also saw the irrefutable truth of the evidence before him. This was the kind of story that didn't just win awards, it changed laws, it destroyed empires. "You've handed me a nuke," Ben said, his voice a reverent whisper as he looked at the hard case. "Are you ready for the fallout?" Aris looked at Silas. He gave a single, sharp nod. "We are," she said, her voice firm, all traces of the desperate victim gone, replaced by the resolve of a warrior. They left the diner, leaving the story in Ben's capable hands. Their part in the fight was over, but a new chapter was beginning. As they walked out into the cold, bright afternoon, Silas felt a shift inside him. He had come to the mountain to lose his purpose, to forget the man he used to be. Instead, he had found a new one. He was still a guardian, still a protector. His sanctuary wasn't a place. It was a principle. It was the unwavering defense of the innocent against the predators of the world. He looked at Aris walking beside him and at Ghost trotting faithfully at his side. His pack. He wasn't alone with his ghosts anymore. The war was over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. The mission was complete. We hope this story of loyalty, courage, and the fight for justice has inspired you. The bond between a human and an animal can be one of the most powerful forces on Earth, a testament to a loyalty that asks for nothing in return. If you agree, comment Amen below. Thank you for watching, and may God bless you and your families.